going to be a tutorial for interpolation points on the Unreal Editor 2.0 Unreal Engine 1. Now, as you can see, I already have a primitive cube made and room subtracted. Now if you'll go to key point and extend it, you'll see the interpolation point actor pretty much in the center. And let's just get straight to it. First of all, I'd like to point out the properties for this. End of Path Boolean is basically marking the end of the path for interpolation points. So if you set this to true, this specific interpolation point will be the end of the path. Skip next path does nothing as far as I know. Field of view modifier, which is similar to the field of view in cameras in the Unreal Movie Studio, or more so if you go to your camera and extend pawn, you can change the FOV angle here, and you'll notice some interesting perspectives there. Now returning to the interpolation point, game speed modifier is literally game speed modifier, as in once you change it to a higher or lower number, it will change the actual speed of the game accordingly. So in other words, you can have a slow-mo sort of interpolation path, or you can speed it up. Just be mindful of the effects once you increase it anywhere above, say, 2 or 0.25. Now the position, and this is one of the prioritized variables here, because this is going to point out what position this specific interpolation point actor is relative to the entire path. So this is going to be 0 because this is the starting path. The starting path is always 0. Rate modifier is a more practical way of slowing down the path. Rather than modifying the entire speed of the game, you can increase or decrease the rate modifier to slow down the actual path. Screen flash fog and screen flash scale are similar to what you see in zone info. That changes a sort of a fade effect or fog effect, which is generally used by other actors, not usually used by interpolation points, and this is actually commonly just left alone. Now that I've shown you the basics of the interpolation point actor itself, it's time to make our path. Firstly, I'd like to point out on the two-dimensional top view that you can see an arrow here. This indicates the angle and direction of the camera or person when the path is hit. So for instance, if I move this way and this is where the path is continuing, it will turn this way. My actor will turn this way. This is just used by a rotator variable. Now let's start making our path, and this is simply done by adding as many as I think up to 70 or 128, something like that. A very high number of interpolation points. The minimum you must have, I believe, is 4 to actually have an Unreal Editor and the game detect a path. This is one of the things you have to sort of play with, but because you don't necessarily know the accuracy of this path. You do not know exactly how it's going to go through. Even after you set up the positions of all the interpolation points, you might have to go through because of a rate modifier error or because of a rotation bug to sort of change that, because more often than not, these interpolation points, once you've modified the pitch or roll, especially of the rotation, they can get a bit buggy. So for instance, if I were to turn this all the way up or all the way down for roll or pitch, there might be some unusual effects once it loops So you just make sure that you're keeping in touch with the rotation of the entirety of the path. And I'm just going to sort of loop it because it's generally what you want for an interpolation path, especially in things such as your own custom flybys, is that you want the path to loop, and you don't want it to necessarily go through anything once it goes back. So for instance, if I wanted to loop it all the way around, and suppose there's other brushes here, I wouldn't want it to stop here and then directly and linearly return to path 1 or position 1. I would want to have a more presentable loop. So this is simply done by returning all the ending paths to, or at least near, the first path. Position 0 is not an actual part of the path, it's sort of a marker. Anyway, now that we have our interpolation points, which again you can play with and you could do all sorts of things with. You don't necessarily have to have them linear. You do not have to retain the zero pitch and zero roll. You can pretty much do anything so long as you're keeping track of all these properties to make sure that it doesn't bug out in the end, if you will. So now that we have our path, you'll notice first of all this is position 0. That's fine. Now your next position will be 1 and 2 and so forth. Now you'll see there's a creation of a line. If you just saw, that is basically the visual path on Unreal Editor that shows where exactly this interpolation path goes through, and what it gives you a general idea of what it will look like in game. You'll notice that this has 3 lines coming out of the white line, and that's sort of like if you've ever done 3D editing and whatnot, or have delved into other editors such as Valve Hammer, or World Hammer rather, and Doom 3 editor, etc. You'll have this 3D marker, which is just a XYZ coordinates, or symbolic thereof. And this will be modified by the rotation or roll. So if you want to roll it or anything of the sort, you'll notice that the lines also change, the red, green, and blue lines. And that's just a visual marker that shows where exactly the camera is, or the pawn is, in terms of rotation. And of course the white line is the actual path whereupon the actor or camera or whatever you're using will go through. So once you've hit the end of your path, you'll have the option to either end it, by which again you can set the end of path to true, or you can loop it by keeping that false. One other thing I'd like to point out about the interpolation point actor is the tag itself. Now if you'll notice, I remove the tag and change it to random tag. You'll notice that the entire path is now inexistent. That's because you have to have the same tag for the collective interpolation points. And the reason this is because once you have multiple interpolation points, it's going to be confusing for the editor to try to pinpoint what exactly you're trying to do. In other words, whether you're trying to select one path or the other. And especially if you are using something like Unreal Movie Studio, you'd want to interpolate a certain path with the camera using the script. So you wouldn't want to, for instance, use the same path in some occasions on some maps. You'd want to use multiple paths, and this is why the tag is important, as with many other actors. Now I'd like to show you what methods there are to using this, and this is generally actually used in flybys with the exception of Unreal Editor, Unreal Movie Studio. So I'm going to find the credits city intro for Unreal Tournament, which uses an interpolation path itself. And just to show you again some of the ways this is done. Okay, so once we go ahead and find our... Okay, now you'll notice first of all that there's a player start in a basic cube, and what this does is simply it has the player up high on above the trigger, because what's going to happen is the player is going to have to touch this trigger, which triggers all interpolation points. You'll notice this trigger does not directly trigger the interpolation points. This trigger triggers the special event, which is set to player path, which then triggers all interpolation points. Meaning what you're going to have to do if you want the player to immediately go on the path once he enters the game is have a trigger, or have some sort of system wherein you can simply have the player, or force the player to trigger a trigger, which is generally set to trigger once only, though it doesn't quite matter. So let's go back to our interpolation point that we were working on. Now I'm going to assume for this that you're simply going to want a basic, typical interpolation path wherein the player simply falls down, onto this path. So this is simply done again by just replicating what we have seen before. You do not have to set B trigger once only to true. So let's first off add a player start, and this is going to be done inside standard cube, and make sure that the player start is in a good position to fall onto the trigger, so that it actually triggers the special event. So I'm going to name the special event my path, and as you could see there, I set the event form in trigger to my path. So let's go to special event, and you could put this anywhere in the map, and this is going to be renamed my path. Now if you remember, we named the interpolation path path 1, so the event for special event will be path 1 to trigger all the interpolation points. Now before we do anything else, we also have to make sure that the initial state is in player path, because if it is not, it will not call the correct function. So now that we have this done, you can add your lights or whatever you want. And again, this is something you have to play with. This is one of those aspects of Unreal Editor that is not necessarily very, very linear. You have to sort of modify go through and modify the path every so often to, you know, perfect it. Last and certainly not least, be sure to change the game type, because if you do not, generally it will, you know, be a problem, because especially if you have a deathmatch game type or something, you wouldn't want bots to spawn as well. Now, if you'll notice, I'm going to return to City Intro, you notice the level properties here. The game type is UT Intro. You can also use the older Unreal 1 game type. Unreal Game Intro, either way, doesn't matter. And it can be any sort of game type, even, you know, even playable game types, so long as there aren't no you know, interlopers such as bots and something of the sort. Technically, you can use deathmatch type for this sort of you know, map, but it's better just to use an intro game type. So now that we have that, and you build geometry, recompile everything, this should work. And there you have it. Like I said, this is something that you have to sort of play with, because if you notice, right now as it's going through, it is working, but it is somewhat rough. So you can smooth it out. This is generally done by simply modifying the rate modifiers, playing with it. You sort of have to have a generated skill through experience to make, you know, well-developed interpolation paths. And that's basically the entirety of, you know, how interpolation points work and whatnot. Again, thanks for watching, and if you would like to submit any requests as to, you know, how to use Unreal Editor in any parts, again, just message me or whatnot.